Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on scientific experiments. The objective of this video is to determine the control and variable in a scientific experiment, write a scientific hypothesis. What we're really going to focus on though is how to make a graph with our Google Sheets and writing a detailed analysis. So these are going to be the principal things that we'll be focusing on. Let me get my pen here. Okay, so these are going to be the main things. I know you guys were probably all taught the scientific method in middle school. Many of you may already have it memorized, okay? But like I said, what we're going to really be focusing on is making the graphs in Google Sheets and how to analyze the data from that graph. So I just created an experiment here. It says a student wanted to know if different types of music can have an effect on plant growth rates. The student set up 4 identical rooms, where each room had the same amount of sunlight, soil, water, and temperature. Each room also had 100 corn seeds planted, and the average height of the corn stalks were taken on a weekly basis. Room number 1 was silent, had no music. Room number 2, constant rock and roll music. Room number 3, classical music. And room number 4, country music. So those are your 4 rooms set up there. And the hypothesis stated is an if-then way. If music is played to the corn seeds, then the corn will grow taller and faster than if no music were played. So that's your hypothesis. Before we go any further, I want to stop for a second. Remember, a hypothesis is an educated guess. It's not a stab in the dark. With that said, don't ever get upset if your hypothesis is wrong. Sometimes that's just as important because you're going to learn something. If your hypothesis turns out to be correct, you didn't really learn anything. You just verified what you already knew. If your hypothesis is wrong, well, then you learned something from the experiment. In either situation, like I said, don't get upset if your hypothesis turns out to be wrong. Okay, a couple things we need to review. Remember the control. The control is the group with the one thing you're testing removed. So obviously in this experiment, the control is going to be room number 1 without the music. That's your control. Okay? So it's the one thing you're testing that is removed. You have to compare it to something. So that's why you have a control in a good scientific experiment. The other term is the variable. The variable is the thing that you're testing. In this case, the variable is the music. Although it's different types of music in the general class of music being played to the corn. That's the variable in this experiment. Okay? So once again, the control has the variable removed from it. All right. Setting up our data table, okay? The next slide I'm going to give you is going to give you a step-by-step instructions on how to set up the data table and turn that into a graph. So here's our data table. So our room 1, which is our control. Okay, and then room 2, the rock and roll, the classical, and then the country. Started off in room 1. The first one, after 1 week, they were a centimeter tall, so they started growing fastest in the rock and roll. And then they kind of went up, and then it stopped right there at 6 centimeters. In the control, stopped at 8 centimeters. The classical one went all the way up to 9 centimeters, and the country music room went up to 5 centimeters, okay? So we need to take that data and turn it into a graph. So sorry for the bad writing here, but I think it's easier for me to put it here if I write it than type it. While you're logged into your Google account through your school district, these are the steps you basically want to follow. So at the top there, you're going to go to your file, okay, and then it'll say spreadsheet, okay, and then it'll give you like a data table, just like on Excel, okay. Column A will be your x-axis. Be sure to label the column first before you begin to put the data in, okay, and then fill in column B, C, and D, just like that for each room that you're going to be doing, okay. Okay. Highlight your data, just kind of click and drag across so the whole thing is highlighted. And once you highlight it, you want to go up to Insert and then click Chart, okay? And then under Chart Type, we don't want a bar graph. This is going to be much better for a line graph. So under Chart Type, you want to go to the arrow and go down to the line chart, okay? And then once you get into the line chart, at the top right, you want to click Customize. And under Customize, that's where you're going to put your axis in and label everything. So you can make sure you give your graph an appropriate title. The title should tell the person looking at the graph what it's about without being too detailed in as few words as possible. be sure you put your units and everything on the horizontal and the vertical axis. And then when you click share with me, then I will get a copy of that through my email account, okay? All right, so here's how the graph will look. Something like this. It's color-coded. That's very easy to see what's going on here. Right away, I'm looking right here at this guy, and I see, okay, boom, that's your classical music. So the classical music was kind of steady. Eddie ended up the highest. But look at the rock and roll here. It grew the fastest, but then it just stunted its growth right there, kind of flatline. The country music, although it wasn't the tallest, it was the steadiest growth all along. Okay, and then the control with no music at all, it was also steady, ended up the second highest. Okay, the next step, write a detailed analysis of your data. This is where most high school students in 9th grade stumble. They end up just doing this for their analysis. They just say, the group with classical grew the tallest, and then they're done. That's not an analysis. An analysis goes into much greater detail. It looks at all aspects of it, okay? So even the analysis I'm giving you probably isn't detailed enough, but it gives you an idea what I'm looking for. For the first 3 weeks, the corn with the rock and roll had the fastest growth rate. By week 5, the corn with the classical music plants were the tallest. At the end of the 6-week experiment, the corn with the classical music was the tallest, followed by the no music room or the control room. The corn with the country music had the shortest growth, but it was also the steadiest growth, increasing 1 centimeter each week. The corn with the rock and roll stopped growing after 4 weeks. That's an analysis. It goes into every room and exactly what's going on from beginning to end. It didn't leave anything out. If you just say, oh, the classical music grew the tallest, you left out some really important stuff. So when I grade your first assignment, that's going to be one of the things I'm looking at. A, can you make a good graph? And B, can you write a detailed analysis of those results? Okay? A couple other things. Usually when you do this, you want to do a conclusion to look back on your hypothesis. So while my conclusion was correct, I wouldn't not call it 100% correct because some of the corn with music ended up shorter than the control. Remember, my hypothesis was if you have music, it'll grow taller. Only the classical music, that should be was taller than the control. More testing needs to be done over a longer period of time. Okay, follow-up. What might a follow-up experiment if you were looking for a way to maximize the height of your corn in the shortest time? Well, there's a couple of right answers here. One thing that stood out in my attention was maybe I would try a combination of rock and roll for the first 3 weeks and then change to classical music after 3 weeks and measure the height. If I had to guess here, maybe the vibrations of the rock and roll were kind of vibrating the soil to get it to germinate and grow faster to begin with, okay? But then for some reason, the plants seemed to like the classical music after they got out of the ground and started growing, okay? So maybe a combination of those two might end up with the tallest plants. Just an idea, okay? So that's pretty much how we'll end up.